Hello, and welcome to another thrilling installment of the OSR Reddit Roundup for today, September 17th, 2021. I'm your host. Welcome. Well met. Glad to see you, whoever's here, whoever's not here. Hope you enjoy it whenever you do see this, or hear it, or listen to it. Since I know this stuff goes in podcast form, I do try to format everything for audio or visual. Probably nobody cares. I don't think I have any particular programming notes today. Last night I had Alyssa Faden on yesterday for another chat. It was a lot of fun. Talked about a little bit of map making, probably more about Chaosium, kind of some of the work she's doing for Chaosium, and then her Call of Cthulhu game. And we finished up just with a little smidgen on minis, which I need to ask her more about. As usual, let me know if there's any oddities with the streams. I noticed my bandwidth seems to be dipping up and down momentarily, so hopefully that is not filtering to your experience. But if it is, let me know. Other than that, let's get on with the show. Giving it a nice refresh, so we make sure we're getting what's new, or what's hot rather. Well, I still am not completely certain how hot is tabulated, but I think it's some mixture of newness and stuff that's been commented on, maybe upvoted or downvoted. Not really sure, but it works for the most part. I do like to, when I'm looking at these, see some of these have some comments, because I am interested to not only see what we have to say about it, but also see what our fellow Redditors have to say about it. Let's scroll on down and see what we can find. Someone started a new Lamentations of the Flame Princess Reddit. Okay, looking for Japan-themed OSR games. I think I have any insight into that. Bricked up church map and dungeon beneath. Warpland review from Polly Kid. Basic dungeon map. All right, come on. Where's some good stuff? 15 years of old school gaming. I'm not sure what that is. Could you review my Heartbreaker? Is it small enough that we could take a look at it? I'm always interested in people in these Heartbreaker projects. I'm going to give it a click, but I'm not. Okay, so this is going to take us to a blog if we follow it. All right, I'm going to skip this one. Seems like it might be too involved. Too much. Is there really such a thing as our art style? I say no. OP level 1 spell. That's smart. All right, wow. We're going through the whole first page, and there's really nothing enticing. OSR vendors / creators at Gen Con. Yeah, I tried to figure out a way to get myself to Gen Con this year, but it didn't happen. Obviously, since I'm here. But maybe next year. Unnatural aging and ability scores. Let's see. OSE chance of triggering a trap. All right, let's check this one out. OSE chance of triggering a trap. Submitted by Monster Hunter Banjo. And they say, so one thing I noticed is that in the core rules, it says if a player performs an action that could trigger the trap, there's a chance the trap could trigger or not. Have you been playing the game this way, or just automatically triggering a trap? I kind of like this rule. If a door is trapped but doesn't trigger until like the third person opens the door, it's actually kind of funny. It makes the trap feel a bit more surprising. I do tend to use, so me in my games in BX, which is essentially the same as OSE, I do tend to use that rule. I like it. For me, I play it as these traps are old, they're decrepit, they don't necessarily work properly. So you might have a pressure plate, for example, and potentially, so let's say it does trigger on the third person of the party to walk across. Maybe that means that it was kind of stuck, and then the first person sort of jiggled it loose, and then the second person got the rest of the dust out but didn't put enough actual pressure to trigger it, and then the third person hit the pressure plate, and then bam, it goes off. Or it could be that you have a pressure plate in a hallway, and the pressure plate takes up a certain amount of space on the floor, but it doesn't cover the entire floor. So you rule that the first and second person, they just happen to step around, step over, didn't actually step on the plate. It's that third person who stepped on the plate. So there are different ways you can visualize it, because with most things in the OSR space, we're not trying to get super granular. This is happening usually during these somewhat abstracted dungeon movement. You know, you're walking down a corridor, but we're not taking our minis and placing them in an actual corridor. Or even if we were, we're not suggesting that the pressure plate for a trap is a 5-foot square. I suppose it could be, or a 10-foot square, whatever. So we're just looking at it like the pressure plate exists somewhere in this space along this part of the corridor. You enter this space that is occupied in some way or in some part by this pressure plate, but you might hit a part of that spot that isn't covered by the pressure plate, but it does share that space. Or, like I said, we're looking at it in that these traps are old, potentially stuck, and so they do not trigger all the time. So there's a couple different ways to look at it, and of course you can do a combination of those. But yeah, I do like it. I like that it does add a little bit of interest in there. You can't necessarily be sure just because the first person made it across the hallway without anything happening. Say the rogue scampers across, scampers down the hallway, gives a thumbs up. Doesn't mean there wasn't a trap there, especially if they weren't checking and paying attention, or maybe they missed a roll or something, but that they just either triggered it and it didn't go off, or they happened to not trigger it when they passed through or over or on that space that the trap occupies. Let's see if there's any useful insight from the Redditors. And again, it looks like my bandwidth is dipped, so let me know if it's affecting the audio or visual qualities. Thror the Second says, use the established 2 in 6 chance of triggering all traps other than a pit trap that is simply a tarp over a hole, which is a 6 in 6 chance without a 10-foot pole. Floor traps, wall traps, chest traps, door traps, all of them. The dungeon is old, traps get dusty, rusty, and crusty. They don't always work. Plus, since many traps are very dangerous, like save or die, you need to give the players a chance. Edited for pit trap clarification. All right, taking up vote there, Thror the Second. One cellist 5032 replies, I like to still give a little warning if the trap doesn't trigger, though, like the sound of clanking or straining machinery. Maybe the pressure plate sinks down slightly and nothing happens. That's an excellent piece of advice. It's going to be very dependent on what you feel like that trap, how that trap is operating, and how the player may have interacted with the trap, but that's certainly good. Scavenger 22, yep, I use it and it's quite effective because people who rush away from monsters may trigger it later. It's definitely true. More or less, you can think of it as a quote-unquote surprise roll. If the PCs are surprised, the trap will trigger. If it fails, the thief could notice it. Also, the clerical spell Find Traps makes more sense if you play that way. Fun stuff, this also lets you add new traps when restocking the dungeon. Well, this is true. I'll give them a foot. I mean, you can always add new stops when restocking the dungeon anyway. And by adding new traps, new features like that, we talk about looking at the perks or abilities that different characters or classes have, spells, whatnot. Something that I think dwarves get is that ability to analyze the architecture, analyze the construction of a place. So if your kobolds come along after the PCs have left a place and they engineer some traps, and I just say kobolds because they're often the ones that are thought of as being sort of trap masters of common OSR beasties, then your dwarf suddenly has something to say when they reach a part of the hallway that clearly has some new masonry or stonework, or has the stonework's been clearly altered, even if it is potentially cleverly disguised. Throw the dwarf a bone and say, hey, you dwarf, you notice this looks a little bit different than the rest of the stuff, even though it's been camouflaged in a way to look the same. All right, so that was OSC chance of triggering a trap. Good question. Fairly easy one to answer. Yeah, let's get back and find something else. As usual, if you happen to be here in the chat and you see me scroll by something that you think is interesting, shout it out, and I'm happy to go back and find it. A video series and a map out. That's actually mine. Or this was shared by GM Frederick, friend of the channel, talking about, or just listing some links to me using mind mapping when I've been doing some of my game prep and recap streams. So if you like those streams, something to check out in there is I use mind maps. I use a mind map, and I posted one of them, or whatever the latest updated one, to the community tab on the YouTube channel, so you can go check it out too. I just like to use mind maps to kind of just be able to draw relationships somewhat quasi-spatially, but usually in terms of what's related to what or what connects with what. You can check that out and see it. I will probably do a video on it, since a few people have remarked on appreciating using mind maps in that way. I will probably make a video on it. It's not the only kind of thing I do, but it's great for kind of, I feel like it's great for just showing things, how all the connections between things. Best system for a group wanting to try OSR out. I think I've kind of done this in the earlier videos. I would probably pick something like BX or OSC for their first time, but it would probably depend on where they're coming from, if they have an idea what they're looking for, so on and so forth. D100 plus clown generator. I'm not going to go in there. And how is this getting downvoted? Who would downvote a clown generator? Take an upvote, please. There's nothing better than a good old clown generator. I mean, what kind of monster would downvote that? Okay, an exploration of old school tabletop role-playing game design principles. I'm sure this is going to be super long, but I am interested. All right, so let's first go in here. It's going to take us here, and I think we're going to get a link, which I'll open in a new tab just so I can keep things nice and neat. Oh, maybe this isn't too long. All right, let's read through this, because this seems like it's got a lot of meat on the bones, so to speak. I will post a link to this in the chat, and I will also mark it down for later. Oh, wait, hold on a second. Let me just get my text editor open so I can keep track of myself. Okay, it is for myself. This is from Leyline, posted on the Leyline Press website, leyline.press. It is titled An Exploration of Old School Tabletop Role-Playing Game Design Principles. And it was, I'm just trying to, whoops. There it is in the chat. And I've also popped it up as a caption. Of course, if you listen to this later, that won't help you. I will try to remember to put it in show notes, or if I split out this part of the video, put it in there. In any case, it's entitled An Exploration of Old School Tabletop Role-Playing Game Design Principles by Panayotis Lines, September 14, 2021. Apologies in advance if I butchered your name, but I do appreciate you putting a name to it, as opposed to nothing, as I've noticed some blogs are wont to do. Looks like this is going to be a series of articles, this being the first. So we are getting in on the ground floor, which is always nice. I will start at the beginning. This is the introduction to a series of articles that will comparatively explore the slew of tabletop role-playing games that have spawned from old school gaming movement. This is often known as the quote-unquote OSR, which means old school revival or old school renaissance. This article will be discussing some of the key design principles that tie these many varied games together. These role-playing games are ostensibly inspired by the original versions of D&D, such as original D&D, the basic and expert line of D&D, as well as AD&D. Agree more about those here, and that goes to some other blog entries. While some of the retro clones, such as Old School Essentials, are faithful recreations of the original rules, other games like Mothership take the aesthetic and principles but turn themselves into something new. In the case of Mothership, by changing the genre to sci-fi horror, adding mechanics like stress, and switching to a D100 roll under system. Interesting that he mentions Mothership, or they mentioned Mothership in particular, because I had seen a fairly spirited discussion in a Discord chat just yesterday as to whether Mothership should properly be called OSR or not. And in fact, somebody had mentioned that the creators of Mothership, when it first came out, were advertising it as OSR, but then had really dropped using the OSR portmanteau for it. I don't really know or really care, but interesting that that Mothership is particularly pulled out or focused on for that, since it seems like it might be a little bit controversial with some people who are serious about trying to set up the boundaries of OSR. In any case, however, in all cases, these games tend to follow a similar set of principles, which we will now discuss. Now we have, I think this is a title, because it's kind of hard because there's an image right beneath it. But yes, it is a title, Emergent Gameplay. Underneath this title is a screen grab of the random monster table. It looks like from either basic or expert. I'm guessing one of those two. Through mechanics such as random encounter tables, rumor tables, weather tables, reaction rules, and wilderness and dungeon exploration structures, old school games encourage emergent play. In practice, this means that both the players and the GM cannot be sure at the start of a play session what will happen. This is because the events of the game will be determined by a mixture of the player's actions and choices, as well as the results of the mechanics and die rolls. For example, in a game of basic and expert D&D, the players may start in a woodland village, decide to head south into the forest, and get a random encounter of 5 bugbears whose reaction is friendly. The GM may then improvise that the bugbears are simply hungry and want to trade because the loggers in the village are destroying their hunting grounds. The players could then decide to aid the bugbears in stopping the loggers, or may decide to fight the bugbears anyway, or might just walk away. This is just one of a myriad of potential outcomes in a game ran with the principles of emergent play. The party may have instead gone north into the mountains and got attacked by a manticore, or the weather table may have produced a storm, in which case the players may have just decided to stay in the village and help the innkeeper with their rat problem. The next heading is Play Agency, and this has a map of a hex map based on the map for the Barbarian Prince board game, which I think was an Avalon Hill game. I think I looked at purchasing that or finding it at some point. Kind of gave up. Player agency is heavily emphasized in old school games. This means that players in the game are given a wide scope of decision making. This applies in both a macro sense of what direction to travel in, whether to fight or flee from a band of soldiers, or whether to explore a haunted tower. It also applies in a micro sense through decisions such as what equipment and resources to spend gold or what retainers to hire. This ties in with the above discussed principle of emergent play, as for emergent play to work, players have to be able to make decisions within the game and have those decisions ultimately matter. As a result of these principles, old school games tend to be designed with sandbox or open design structures, as these structures emphasize player agency by offering a wide range of options on how to approach the game world. The classic examples of these are the wilderness and dungeon crawl. Wilderness exploration is the quintessential sandbox, as it gives players freedom to explore a large environment in any way they wish. This map, usually drawn on a hex grid, can include a mixture of locations that the GM has designed for the players to find, such as a town, a monster lair, or an ancient ruin, and be further spiced up with emergent elements such as random encounter tables. Whilst a dungeon crawl seems more limited in scope than a wilderness crawl, old school dungeons are typically designed in a way that encourages multiple approaches. This term of design is often referred to as Jacqueing, after Janelle Jacquet, who wrote, I think it's Jacquet's with an S, but I'm not absolutely sure, who wrote a lot of early published D&D dungeons such as the Caverns of Thracia. These varied approaches can include literal physical ones, such as a dungeon having multiple entrances and routes to explore. They can also include varied roleplay approaches, such as dungeons having multiple factions within that can be bargained with or played off of one another. A dungeon can also fit neatly into a wilderness map, with players making a foray into the dungeon, retreating, and then perhaps returning at a later time to delve deeper. So just so far, I mean, interesting stuff, right? It's the kind of stuff that, yeah, we think about, okay, yeah, this is definitely OSR play. One thing that's interesting is that when you look at how D&D developed, even before you got to second edition, there was starting to be a trend with modules and adventures becoming more linear and reducing the sandbox. And this happens in some modules very early. For example, something like any of the I don't want to say any of the tournament, but some of the definitely Tomb of Horrors, for example, doesn't have. I mean, the dungeon itself isn't linear, right? But there's nothing outside of it. Certainly, when you get up to Ravenloft into the Dragonlance modules, I think they are often seen as the beginning of extremely linear, to the point where in some of the Dragonlance modules, I think you have very little choice over stuff that's happening. You're kind of buoyed along because in some ways you become tethered to the Dragonlance timeline that's in the books and working through the modules, so that you really don't have the freedom to do anything. And this is before I think we're even into second edition. So clearly things that were existing in the OSR space. And you can make of that what you will, but I think it does maybe put a little bit of, we have to understand that just because it's OSR, it doesn't mean that everyone was playing in sandbox games. It doesn't mean everyone was enjoying or wanting to do sandbox games. I don't think that TSR or anybody else who was putting out linear modules that became popular were pushing that on the game playing whoever was playing the game playing population. I think actually that a lot of players and a lot of GMs, I think they were following the money, basically following what was getting people's attention. And I think if we want to call it adventure path style of adventure, that's fairly fixed for the most part, maybe has a couple of branches, but you're pretty much on, in a sense, rails. Might be wide rails with more room to maneuver, or narrow rails where you're more focused, was something that a fair amount of players and GMs and other folk were interested in, maybe because of the earlier sandbox type of game style that some folks might have found complicated, didn't have time for, et cetera, gravitating towards these other kinds of games. But this was happening during, the original, wasn't OSR at the time, it was just original gaming circles. But it's often gets set aside. We want to sort of forget that part of the evolution of the game in favor of looking back to the more sandboxy type modules. But the movement from sandbox to more linear adventure paths was something that was happening during the original OSR spell. So we got to be careful when we want to say that the OSR was sandbox gaming above all. It started there, kind of pushed away from there. And depending on where you want to put games like 3.x, is that OSR? Is it in some kind of weird quasi OSR, where that sits in your categorization of these gaming styles? Not that you couldn't play sandbox games in there, but a lot of the official products were pretty linear. So interesting stuff there. I think the examples, Caverns of Thracia is probably one of the ultimate published examples of having a very sandboxy, open-ended, multi, I don't want to say what you want to call it, multi-dimensional dungeon design. Certainly things like hex maps. Interesting that you will get people who are not fans of OSR games. We'll talk about play agency not as something that they feel like OSR games really kind of, but something that OSR games actually, at least I feel like I've heard people say that they have found OSR games, or at least their interpretation of OSR games maybe, is that they don't promote player agency. Certainly there are spells and things that some people will say, oh, these take away player agency. Things like if someone gets charmed, or if someone gets a gayest, or some other kind of spell like that. But I tend to agree that you have a high amount of player agency. Though, again, that depends on if you're playing in a very narrative game or a sandbox game. In a sandbox game, yeah, you have lots of player agency. If you're playing in something like Ravenloft, for example, the original Ravenloft module, you do have some agency, but you actually lose it as the game goes on because it's really meant to be just one forward momentum from when you enter the pocket dimension or the plane, and then you kind of cruise along, and it kind of locks things out. Where once you go into the castle, you can't go back. Once you enter Ravenloft, you can't go back. So not everything was necessarily player agency in the original one. Maybe the point is less about that than whether the games that call themselves OSR now are super interested in player agency, maybe. But things to keep in mind. The next header is rules light. Old school games typically have a simple core of rules, making them quick to pick up and play. Rules focus more on gameplay structures than specific minutiae. For example, a game may include rules on how to structure wilderness exploration, but won't include rules that cover every specific situation that may arise when exploring the wilderness. Nor do they typically include large lists of character skills for hunting, survival, tracking, wood collecting, and so on. Instead, they allow players to declare what actions they want to take in the game and leave it to the GM to adjudicate. This practice is known as, quote, rulings not rules, whereby the GM running the game will make up rulings during play that suit what players want to do rather than being beholden to the rules text. This also further encourages players' agency, as players have a lot more flexibility to make choices within a game where they aren't as worried about whether the rules will allow them to do a thing. Character creation tends to be quick, simple, and typically randomized in old school games. In original D&D, you would roll 3d6 in order for each of your character's statistics, roll your hit points, pick a class and some equipment, and you're ready to play. This lowers the complex load of creating a character and lets you get straight into play. I think this is mostly true, right? First edition, the Player's Handbook and DMG would probably not. I'd be hard pressed to fit that into any definition of rules light. There are probably other games they would look at and say, yeah, that might not be rules light. I mean, they're taking a fairly specific stance in this blog of looking at just D&D. So games that had skills and things back then, maybe things like Traveler or First Edition Pendragon, I'm sure there are others, seem like maybe they're excluding a little bit from this discussion of OSR. It seems specifically D&D based games. But I suppose in general, not too much to comment on. Just quibbles, maybe. Next heading is high lethality and low power level. With some artwork from B2 to Keep on the Borderlands, showing the party fighting an owlbear. Within the original D&D rules set, magic users would start with 1d4 hit points in one spell. When you reached 0 hit points, you died, and most weapons did d6 damage. This sets the tone for old school games. Characters can die incredibly quickly and easily and tend to be limited in terms of their power. This forces players to be creative as to how they approach situations in the game, as they can't as easily rely on their character's overall strength. This ties into the simple rules of old school games. Quick character creation means that a character dying isn't as frustrating as a new one can be made in 15 minutes or so. A low power level suits a rules-light game, as characters tend to have significantly less abilities to remember and play. In a wider sense, this also serves as counterbalance towards the open nature of old school games, as it limits the player character's power into a far more manageable realm of actions, and can often deliver harsh consequences in the form of character death if players push too hard into the unknown. Many old school inspired games, for example Mothership, riff off of the high lethality and low power design by framing themselves within the horror genre. This genre suits a game where characters can die easily and are typically weaker compared to the horrors. This genre also puts an emphasis on survival, which a key component is managing resources. Nothing particularly groundbreaking or earth-shattering, but yes, right. We tend to think of old school games, certainly in BX and other games, in which you are very low on hit points, have very few native abilities to count on. How are you gonna handle that? Of course, this doesn't work for everybody. Some players are certainly, and some GMs might feel like they don't have enough that they like to be able to count on some things that they can do well, which I can appreciate. It is nice to be able to look at and say, hey, I'm maybe I'm good at one thing, but here's that one thing. In an OSR game, you might be the fighter and you're not particularly good at anything. Yeah, you're slightly better maybe at attacking things than other players, but there's nothing you could point out and say, this is my one badass thing. But another part of that is the OSR concept, which isn't mentioned here, which is often that zero to hero, that you start off as a little bit better than a peasant with potential. And then if you survive and you advance, you become a hero potentially, or a villain, or a corpse. On to resource management with an image of Ye Fast Pack, which was from The Lost City, showing some example equipment packs. Resources tend to be emphasized within old school inspired games. This includes the likes of food, water, and gold as tracking encumbrance. In original D&D, the core progression mechanic was 1 experience point per gold piece that the party found. This mechanic encouraged exploration and also resulted in risk-reward decisions. Carrying too much gold would slow you down and therefore risk more random encounters in the wilderness, but you needed that gold to advance. It also made planning expeditions important. For example, bringing pack animals would help you carry that additional load of treasure and gold. However, it may also make you prey to wild animals, such as wolves, that make it more difficult to evade enemy groups in the wild. Many old-school inspired games use a similar gold for XP progression mechanic, and even those that don't still emphasize tracking of resources and survival elements as a key gameplay component. The game's being rules light allows more space for the tracking of items and encumbrance. Equipment also forms a far more important role within the game, as it works as a quite literal toolkit to resolve problems. This is often key, as the low power level of the games means that players can't solely rely on their character skills, spells, and abilities to resolve problems, have to think their way laterally through situations. For further reading, we can look at the Principia Apocrypha, which discusses some of these principles in more detail, and then that's the end of this particular article. So yeah, I think it's a fairly good introduction. I think if there's maybe one thing about it I might say is that it is looking at OSR as only things that seem to be have a D&D as their ancient or old point of reference or inspiration. So this is really looking at OSR as games that are inspired or based upon in some from some version of D&D. And I think it's a little bit broader than that. And the other thing is, in particular, it's looking at really AD&D, Basic Expert, and 3 Brown Books. But I think that there are OSR products that are based on 3.x. There are certainly ones that are based on D&D, AD&D 2nd edition. So by narrowing the field, I think they've made it easier to find their uniting elements, but maybe it's not then quite as useful, because people are going to say, yeah, but there are OSR games that are clearly outside this field, even within the realms of games that are based on D&D. If you're based on D&D 2nd edition or 3rd edition, they would not necessarily fit into some of these principles, mostly probably in terms of the rules lightness. But then even AD&D, if you take everything in the DMG, doesn't fit much into the rules lightness. Though you have to remember with the DMG that it, not that it's really positioned this way, but I feel like I was always essentially all of these house rules and things that Gygax had spent almost a decade or whatever, 7 years answering questions and dragging and trying to, I'm sure, get regularized or standardized rules for tournament play and places like Gen Con where they're running games, and said, I'm going to throw this all into this book so that we can have a standard version. Because the one thing with rulings over rules, it's great, but what you end up finding is that the same questions are coming up that need rules often, and not just within one gaming group, but amongst different gaming groups. So people keep coming up with their own rulings, which again is fine in isolation, but now maybe you're trying to do organized play and you don't need 8 different ways of handling drowning. Let's say something that might come up fairly often, depending on circumstances. What do you do when you're drowning? And you have 8 different groups, or however many 100 GMs saying, okay, I have my own rules for drowning. it gets to a point where you go, you know what, we want to have people coming to conventions or playing games at a gaming shop, some other thing, and we just need to have a rule for drowning that we could just send out. Excuse me, losing my voice. We need one set of drowning rules that we can just send out to everybody and broadcast. And then if you know that if you go into a gaming shop in Topeka, Kansas, if you go to Gen Con in Indianapolis or wherever, I think it's in Indianapolis, or if you're in upstate New York at a friend's house, you're going all these different places, you kind of know the rules for drowning. Because when you take away the DMG and all that stuff, basically, really AD&D is basically the 3 brown books plus the Greyhawk supplement with I think maybe a couple of tweaks here, but that's essentially that's it. But then they added on a slew of the extra rules. But this was excuse me, boy, it was a good read. I was kind of hoping it had a little bit more, something a little more opinionated, but it is. I assume this is laying the groundwork for something in the next series. Maybe we'll run across it in the next OSR roundup. Did I give him an upvote? I did. Let's go back. Man, it's halfway through and I feel like I haven't found anything really amazing. And I don't mean that article wasn't amazing, but I just mean something more discussion, something that spurs more discussion. Okay, someone's asking for rules on hunting, feedback for rules for hunting prototype. All right, let's check that out. Feedback for these hunting rules prototype submitted by Ship Sailing 94. Take an upvote. Okay, so I guess they have a prototype or a draft of some hunting rules. They're looking for feedback. Let's see what they got, and maybe we can give them some feedback. For every wilderness turn, 6 hours spent hunting, you encounter an animal worth 1d6 minus 1 rations. Special, when you roll a 1, you encounter something dangerous instead. When you roll a 6, roll another d6 and add it to the result for every 6 rolled. This indicates the game trail of a large animal worth some rations. Some in brackets, maybe meaning you're going to add them all together. This is sum of all those d6 rolls. It will take 1 exploration turn for each additional die rolled to find it. When you encounter prey, you have to describe how you try to catch it. If the animal is a herd animal, roll 1d6 to find out how many. Adding another die for each 6 rolls. So I think it's, again, they're using, I'm guessing this is an exploding d6 situation. You can also set a trap on the trail and check when the time has come. Roll a d6 for each trap caught. 1 to 3, the animal was caught. 4 to 5, the animal wasn't caught, but it's nearby. I'm not sure how you would know that. 6, the animal isn't caught, the trap is broken or was set off. Then I would have a table with animals divided by size. Okay, so let's see if we can unpack this a little bit. So he's dividing up, I don't know if I've ever heard of a wilderness turn, but I'll just take it as read for now. So for you spend 6 hours. And if you do, you encounter an animal that's worth 1d6 minus 1 rations. So that means we're working at 0 to 5. We could probably position it that if you roll a 1, you just don't encounter anything. For a single 6-hour span, do we think that's good? I mean, you want to balance, right, gameability with some kind of realism. This is where I would probably want to have something in terms of with the type of wilderness you're in. Maybe just using the random encounter data that we already have. Whatever you're rolling for random encounters, you're going to roll one of those, and that gives you the ration types. Maybe add the -1. Something like that might just be helpful because we already have those tables potentially. So do we need them again? I'm not a hunter. Someone could maybe say, if there are any hunters in the chat right now, let me know. Is 6 hours a decent time for hunting, given that you're doing it while you're traveling? You're not able to set up in the best conditions, right? You are on the road. You are traveling through some wilderness, and wherever you are, that's where you're trying to hunt. So it's not a situation where you're hunting at a hunting ranch, or you are able to hunt at some place where you know the animals are going to be. This is just, you're somewhere in the woods and you realize we need some food, and you're going to go out and find it. 6 hours seems like not actually a lot. And I might want to make it more of an interesting decision by somehow, how much time do you want to spend? Same thing with setting a trap. You're going to set a trap and leave it for 6 hours. You're going to set a trap and leave it for a day. I don't think on a 6 hours, that's enough. I wouldn't put for just 1 6 hour time span that half the time you catch an animal. I think I'd want something more than, and I might want something else to say, well, what kind of, there's not the same trap for every sort of animal. A bear trap works for bears. I don't know that it works for everything else. Maybe it does. Maybe it doesn't. And then what kind of traps are you making? What are the skills for making a trap? But do I want to tie that to a particular character class? Do I want to make this a ranger thing or a druid thing or maybe a rogue thing? Let's say I want to have rogues be sort of wilderness rogues as well as more urban rogues. Do I want to make this a rogue thing? I feel like I need a little more. How is this supposed to work? But I also want to have more time. I mean, 6 hours is not a short amount of time, but I don't know that it's enough given everything. I might want to make it longer. Or maybe allow whoever's doing this to spend more time. Hey, if you do it for every 6 hours spent, maybe you get a die to roll. And we could do something with the dice. Instead of doing this exploding sixes, though we could maybe still do that, you get extra dice. So that if you spend 12 hours hunting, now you're getting 2 dice. If you spend 18 hours hunting, 3 dice, 24 hours, 4 dice, so on and so forth. Of course, spending 24 hours in a hunting expedition might not be doable, but it could be if you wanted to set a trap and have it sit for a day. I mean, I've watched some of those Naked and Afraid type shows or those Survival Man shows, and they often don't. It often takes a while for those traps to pay off, even when they feel like they're putting them in a good spot with fairly good bait. Doesn't always go, but we're playing a game. And the game is not Survivor Man, though. A Survivor Man OSR game, I mean, it might be pretty good. So that probably would be my initial feedback, is I'd want a little bit more, or I'd want to, let's see, I'm always a fan of taking stuff that already exists in systems and recycling and reusing them as much as possible. So we have random encounter tables, which do tell us a bit about how often we're running into things in particular environments. Let's leverage that instead of coming up with a whole new roll. Let's just roll back on that table. And maybe we use 6 hour time frames. Certainly, if you think about, let's say for me, when I'm running a hex crawl, I check for encounters for the day and the night, right? So every 12 hours an encounter check. So if I let a trap sit for 12 hours, that would give me 1 encounter check. And I could just roll an random encounter for that trap. What did that trap encounter, or what encountered that trap? If you leave it overnight, you get another roll. What encountered the trap during the night, and then so on and so forth, which is very easy. The only thing I've added to the equation is now I have a trap, but that trap is behaving in the same way using the same systems that already exist. So I don't want to leverage those as much as possible. Only add in what I really need to, and I probably would want to make time more of a factor. The party can choose to spend as much time as they want. There's probably some minimum time you have to spend. Otherwise, that's kind of your regular random encounter. If you walked into this part of the woods and I rolled a random encounter and you didn't get anything, then if you're only spending an hour hunting around, then you just don't find anything because there was nothing really close enough for you to find. You have to spend at least, say, 6 hours, but then after that, it's really up to you. Terrence in with the drinking your pee, the OSR survival game. What was that? Was that dodgeball when he says I forget the guy's name, says I drink my urine because it's good for me and I like the taste. He clearly is into the OSR survival game. Yep. That's one way to do it. That's my initial feedback. All right, what some other people have. Maybe they got some better than me. Immediate Deer 5634 commented, someone said recently in a Hex Crawl post that there's a difference between procedures and adventuring for something along those lines. If gameplay doesn't provide for agency or meaningful choices for players, it is a procedure. The implication is that procedural play isn't fun on the player's end. I'll give them an upvote. So I think what they're saying is that if you're doing a whole bunch of stuff that doesn't have choices attached, doesn't tend to be fun if you're just kind of rolling dice. I tend to think of procedures as the stuff that's happening on the GM side of the screen. So the players enter an area. There are certain procedures that I'm rolling. Might be wandering monsters. Might be weather. Might be something else. I don't know if I want to have some other area effect that might kick in, or whatever it would be. Procedural might also be in terms of I'm rolling for a random feature in this woods. I know it's forest. In this particular forest, I want to roll for what you might call it a sub-hex feature or a local feature. What might that be? That's when I want to roll. Those are not player facing. The procedural stuff is behind the screen. This is suggesting that there's procedural stuff that's on the player side. I don't know. I just don't see it that way, but I can see something like if you're hunting in this person's case, this hunting, you have two decisions to make. Or maybe, yeah, I guess it's even two decisions. I guess either decision is active hunting or setting a trap on a game trail. And that's it. Everything else is stuff rolled behind the screen. That could be okay. Like I mentioned, I'd want to give them more. I think I'd want to give them more decisions in that mix than the original one does. Is it fun? I don't know. I think whenever you're rolling dice, there's a certain amount of fun. I think they tried to kind of add some things in there that could add some tension to the moment. Do you get a super dangerous animal? Do you find some like megafauna type animal? But I don't know. I guess maybe that or whatever the Hex Crawl post, I'm not sure I agree with their choice of how they define procedural. I would say that there's maybe not enough of a meaningful choice because really it's whether are you going to hunt at all, and if you're going to hunt, are you going to have a trap? Other than that, probably not as much as I would like. I gave him an upvote, and then Frickle Frack Rock says the only way is to try it out, which is ultimately true. I think if you're playing frequently enough, these can be behind the table rules that you just tell them to say these things and roll these dice, then describe the results and have a little mini adventure. If they're hunting often enough, you may want to simplify this a bit. Try it out and see what works and what doesn't. Frankly, it's a little hard for me to grasp at first glance and doesn't seem immediately intuitive. For your consideration, here are the hunting rules used at the BX adjacent table I play at, specifically written by my GM for my vampire. My GM for my vampire. Oh, I see. By their GM for their vampire character who needs to hunt literally daily. All right, so this one, which I guess is kind of vampire hunting, but maybe is more broadly applicable. And what I meant by that was vampires on the hunt, not somebody hunting vampires. Rules for hunting prey. Each check takes an hour. A successful wisdom check results in finding no fuss, no must prey, like rats, squirrels, cows, etc. Advantage in city, forest, swamp. Disadvantage in desert, mountains, oceans. That fills their blood requirements for the day. A critical success means they also had treasure. A failed wisdom check results in a random encounter roll. A critical failure means the encounter starts with the vampire unaware that they are the prey. Okay. So what I like about this one is it does take into account what sort of environment you're in. I think, again, I would probably just lean on the random encounter tables, or as far as chance of encounters that we already have, but this does take that into account. What I don't like is it's relying on a wisdom check, which doesn't scale at all with this vampire's, whatever their class level is. In this case, I would probably have something where you're rolling a die and maybe you're adding your class level to it. And then if you want to have wisdom on it at the end, you can add that too. So you can have something like if you're a second level vampire, whatever, and you have a 13 wisdom, which I think is a +1, if I'm remembering correctly, that would be a +3. So you'd roll some dice, add your +3 to it, and then see what you get, which would, to me, make sense because one would think the better you get at being a vampire, having been it for a longer period of time, the easier it will be to find that stuff, that you're not still fumbling around the same as a first level vampire as you are as a 13th or whatever level vampire. But that's just me. This one definitely is more simple, and it does give you some crit success, crit fail type of thing, which I like, a little bit more flexibility in the results. I'm not sure about finding treasure. I wouldn't want to give much treasure. I would probably use, if I was going to say, oh, they had some treasure or something, I would probably use the very lowest, whatever the weakest treasure table is. I wouldn't want you to find something magic. Oh, you found a Vorpal sword because you rolled a die to feed. That's not how I'd run it. But hey, that's a good option, and it definitely is a bit more simple. Give them an upvote. All right, that's some hunting rules prototypes, or a prototype. Coastal encounter ideas. Let's check this one out. Coastal encounter ideas posted by Non-Dairy Giant. Take an upvote, Mr. Non-Dairy Giant. Swig of water for the working man. I'm running a jungle hex crawl. I didn't account for the fact that my players have a boat. I've begun traveling around the coast of my jungle. I'm struggling to come up with interesting encounters for them, as it seems like there's not much interesting interaction to be had while sitting in a rowboat. Really? Any suggestions or references would be greatly appreciated. I feel like you got to just really shake that imagination of yours. Is a struggle coming up with interesting encounters? There's not much interesting to be had while sitting in a rowboat. I mean, there's so many creatures out there, and you're in a rowboat. I mean, just being bumped by something of medium or larger size has at least some chance of tipping over the entire boat into, I don't know, eel-infested waters. There's wave action. There's tides. There's whatever larger creatures are in the boat. There's potentially things flying. The great thing about being in a boat from an encounter perspective is that you're very limited. Let's say there's a flock of sturges that show up overhead. Can't really run because there's nowhere to run. You could just try to row your boat, and you're not going to move very fast, especially if you might be rowing against the tide or against the current or anything else. So that really changed the nature of a swarm encounter like that, or a flock or something with a bunch of individuals in it, however you want to run it. But any kind of large creature like that, or a large group of creatures that you can encounter out in the wilderness. And now you're sitting in this little 8, 10, 12-foot boat in which at least a few of you have to row. So, which means if you've got your hands rowing, you can't use weapons. You can't even really protect yourself. I mean, this is a gold mine of adventures, or of encounters, I would say. What about RUSs, says Terrence? Well, I suppose they swim. No reason why they can't swim. So I think you got to really work on that imaginative aspect. Open your mind. Just take a look. Just flip through your locally sourced monster manual and just look at all the things that could live in waters. Think of all the things in our own world that live in waters. Large lizards and reptiles, crocodiles, alligators, really all kinds of things, even things that aren't necessarily harmful in themselves. If you think about manatees and creatures like that don't mean anybody any harm, but again, you get bumped by one, you fall into the water, you're wearing heavy armor, you're sinking like a stone, and then not only do you have whatever might be on the surface of the water, but what's at the bottom of the water, and how are you getting out of there before you drown? It just seems like there's a lot of opportunity. And of course, you're horribly exposed to anything that's on land, as is often the trope in movies in which when you see some outsiders who are either arriving or going down ashore by boat. If you think of, for example, Apocalypse Now, I think they take automatic fire, and then I think eventually they get bows and arrows and spears are thrown at them. But you're a sitting duck in that boat, and if you're within range of the shore and there are native folk who don't want you there, they can take pot shots at you, and you have very little places to go, and you're not even in a power boat, so you can't even just turn on the gas and really try to get moving, as you're stuck. And because you have to row the thing, you might have 2/3 of your party might not be able to do anything because they're rowing the boat. So I think there's a lot of interesting things you can do with that without having to really get into really super crazy encounters. You got to open your mind there. Terrence back in says, a deadly manatee attack is the most embarrassing way to die. Yes. If you die due to manatee misadventure, that would be sad, right? Seward sea cow accident. Yes, embarrassing, right? I'm thinking of, if there was some case where there was, piranha in the water or something like that. And yeah, you just get bumped in the water and that's where the bull sharks are hanging out or something else. There's a ton of stuff. I think this person needs to really just kind of maybe look at some media, watch some movies that feature some boat action. There's a lot there. I think if you're not seeing interesting encounters you can have with the boats and not turning it into something that your party should be nervous about, your party should be nervous about on a shore of some area that could be eminently very dangerous, just being out on a boat. Unless they're going to be out further out in the waters. And of course, further out in the waters has its advantages. Certainly, you might be out of bow range. Certainly, you're going to be potentially out of certain areas of danger, but then there are other dangers. Obviously, the deeper out in the water you go, the more dangerous the water itself becomes. If there's wave action or there's any kind of choppiness to the water, that has its own dangers. Certainly, that's where the larger creatures are. They might be outside if we're looking at kind of tropical jungle areas, if you're outside the reef system, you can even within the reef system, you can run aground depending on the tides. Play with the tidal actions. Run aground on the reef, and the reefs are sharp. Those. If you watch Castaway and movies of that sort, when he is contending with the reef, it's no easy matter. It's not that easy. Reefs played havoc with sailors and ships, things like that. There's a lot. There is a lot there. I think that they are leaving a lot of stuff on the table if they really are having a hard time coming up with encounter ideas. Hedgehogs in hats says fishermen, whatever those humanoid fish monsters are called now again, water monsters that like to eat boats, and Liam Neeson. All good choices, even Liam Neeson taking up vote. Wizard Lady says, bloated pale bodies bobbing up along the coast, maze of shipwrecks and obscuring fog, the rotting corpse of a great and terrible beast washed ashore from the deepest depths. The parasites are the size of dogs and men and skitter about. Now, can I give them, all right, let me give them an upvote. Man, they need an upvote just for that. That is beautifulous. Death metal sirens. Imperial galleons loaded with treasure. A hired privateer harasses the party. Sea turns red. Whirlpool monster. Yeah. There's and again, she delved into more weirder encounters, but even simple things. I really liked it. I really think that something that's overrated is you just got to chain together some simple things. Yeah, a manatee. A manatee bumps you. Suddenly, the fighter in their plate mail is dumped in the water, potentially somebody else as well. How is the fighter handling that? Can they get their armor off quickly enough? Are they losing their armor? How much other stuff is being lost? Were there packs in the boat that fall in the water? Then, of course, if there are fish or things in the water that don't bother you when you're in the boat, but now suddenly as you're flailing around and sinking, those same creatures are taking an intense interest in you. Suddenly you have a really fascinating, dangerous, intriguing situation. How much do you go after your whatever packs have fallen in the water? How much are you helping out the fighter? What is the fighter doing to help themselves? What are the creatures doing in relation to the fighter? What is the boat doing? Because the boat, if it's going with the current, is potentially being pushed, or even if it's not, it was the fighter someone who was rowing the boat. Is the fighter moving one way and the boat moving another way? Or are they moving away from each other in a sort of a horizontal way, where maybe they're both in the current, but now they're not that close to each other? What time of day is it? Is it getting dark? Is it dark? Were they traveling at night? So much stuff, but the components are very simple. And that's before you add in really kind of cool, crazier, weirder fantasy elements. Okay. Friendly natives in need of help. Unfriendly natives in need of loot and or meat, if you know what I mean. This was posted by Witchhammer. Mangrove swamp with associated animals, fish, reptiles, all too smart and possibly demonic. Monkeys, undead, all too active plants, and so on. Giant river delta inhabited by a pod of pink telepathic dolphins who need help defending. Defeating a tribe of Marrow that have moved into the area to hunt said dolphins. Crabs, giant ones, yep, giant enemy crabs approaching. Small ones in a small, crabs in a swarm. Right, there's, take an upvote. There's a ton of stuff here. A ton. All right, we're just about at an hour. Let me see if I can find one more to finish off strong. I like to finish off strong when I can. Got a ruined Vampire Castle Adventure. Is that a question or is this an answer? Let's take a quick look. This is a question. I don't really have a good one. I don't have an answer offhand, so I'm going to skip it. Oh, here we go. Let's try this one. They got downvoted. What are you downvoting people for? 10 hints and tricks for OSR Dungeon Masters. Okay, it's a YouTube video. All right, I'll give him an upvote because, look, I got, you got, whoa, someone downvote him? Another downvote? Oh, show me that one. All right, upvote for them. I don't mind the promotion. They should probably have, I know there are tags you could put to more that highlight that we're doing is promotion, but look, as somebody who too often has to promote material, I'm not going to downvote someone else for having to get out there, and you got to pimp your stuff. And people should be a little bit, you don't need to like it. You don't need to love it. You don't need to downvote it either. Just leave it alone. Doesn't really do you any harm. Let's see. Why would you choose to play White Hack over some other major candidates in the OSR? I don't know. Okay, here we go. This is a good question. All right. So it's going to take us to a blog entry. So I'm gonna flip to the comments first, and then I'll open the blog entry in a new tab so that I can keep it. Okay, this was posted to the secret game blog Il Gioco Segreto. Hopefully I didn't butcher that. Posted on the 14th, so a couple days ago, but still fairly fresh. I'm going to add it to the blog. Let me add it to my notes, my notepad notes. Add it to my notepad notes. Let me add it to here. The title is Questioning Morale and Reaction Rules. Go. So if you want to follow along, you can grab the link in the chat. Posted by no particular author. Please put a name. Put a name. Give it a name. Questioning morale and reaction rules. I am writing a D20 or so table of combat events to spice up old school combat, and it's turning into a table of enemy tactics, which I dig. It's also making me think about morale rolls, because those completely disregard tactics. It's a roll to gauge the troops' emotion. Usually we make a monster flee or surrender when they fail a morale, but what about parlay? What about giving PCs gold to let the monsters go, or some other kind of exchange? What about tactical escapes or fake escapes to lead PCs into traps? What about fake surrendering to then stab PCs in the back? I think it's not a good thing to exclusively rely on morale to decide if monsters keep fighting. Sometimes an intelligent monster leader may choose to escape a tactic. Let's see. Okay, let me keep going. I think this person is somewhat misunderstanding the role of morale checks and what to do with them. So they're kind of, what I would say is they're beginnings from a faulty premise. But before I get into that more, let's keep reading what they have, and then we can come back to this. Come back to that at the end. Morale is what it says on the tin. In the troops' conviction they can reach their objective if they keep fighting, and a morale system works as long as there are concrete possibilities for the monsters to reach their objective, or if the monster is too dumb to realize that this is not the case. Also, notice how I talked about quote-unquote objectives. This is making me question reaction rolls as well. It would be better to really think about what a negative or positive reaction roll means, or disregard them entirely. A monster wouldn't just attack PCs for no reason, and there are 1,000 reasons that a monster would want to attack a PC. And here we get some, okay, so he's just listing a bunch of reasons. That's fine. They're referencing some posts about encounter stakes and a modified reaction table by Patrick Stewart, which I'll have to come back to for later. Is there a way I could save these? Yeah, I'll add these to something I can read later. Might have to come back to those later. The reaction roll doesn't tell you these things, but they're quite important. As you can see, these motives and objectives may change the course of combat quite a bit. So what I will try to do in the future is to not rely completely on morale and reaction rolls for monster tactics and reactions, but I would act as a real monster would act, or as a PC would act, and only use morale rolls to see if the monster has it in them to keep fighting. And I will question the reaction roll, what makes the monster react in this way. So I think they have a fairly... I won't say fair. They have a misunderstanding, I think, of how to use these rolls, because what they're suggesting, saying, "Hey, this roll is not taking these things into account." It's not meant to. What you were supposed to do, in my opinion, anyway, is you were supposed to roll these, and then you're supposed to figure out what that means for the monster. For example, let's take an example of what monsters would do if they want to try to escape. There's nothing about a morale roll that says if the monster's trying to flee or surrender, what that looks like in the game. It could very well look like a monster trying to parlay. It could very well look like the monsters dropping their weapons and fleeing. It could very well look at the monsters giving up some of their loot to try to escape. The morale rolls, they give you some general values in the book to give you an idea of what it means, but really you're looking at just a severity of result. If a monster is to roll, for example, the worst morale possible, then you might look at that and say that that monster is in absolute panic. And so you think to yourself, what would a monster in absolute panic look like in this case? Generally, we think of that as dropping whatever that is and fleeing, because the whole point is they are so panicked that they're not thinking in their right mind anymore, which happens to intelligent people and intelligent monsters. You see it in all kinds of situations. People freeze, people run, people do all kinds of crazy stuff when they're under just kind of strain. They're broken, so they're running. What if they rolled a little bit better than that, but still poorly? Their mind is still about them, but clearly they are not interested in continuing any hostilities. What might that look like? That might look like them trying to pay off the PCs. That might look like them surrendering. That might look like them parlaying. It could be all of those things. Just because you're rolling a morale roll doesn't mean you're throwing away this idea of what the monster means to do. It's really supposed to be, okay, this is what the monster's thinking inside, given the context of where the monster is, who the monster is, what the PCs are doing, what would the monster do when it's at this state of mind. It's the same thing with reaction rolls. You can use reaction rolls for a shopkeeper. If they roll the worst reaction possible, does that mean they attack? They hop over the counter and grab the nearest weapon and start trying to hack into the PCs? No, but it may mean that they are hostile in other ways. Same thing with a very positive roll. If the PCs try to break into the king's fort and some guards find them and they roll really high on a reaction, does that mean that the guards now join the players to help storm the castle? Maybe, maybe not. Probably not. But it might mean that they're not as harsh as they could be. Maybe they try to capture the PCs instead of outright kill them. Maybe they try to let the PCs go with a warning. What are you doing here? If I see you again, I'm going to hurt you. But because you saved my cousin that one time, you have some reputation here. I'm gonna let you go. Don't let me see you again. Something like that. Many ways to play it. I think this person is taking a way too black and white picture to these and not really thinking about what it really means, which is in the context of the moment, how does this creature feel about these other creatures being the party? How is this creature feel about, like they said, their own opportunity to complete whatever their objective is? And if they're feeling really, really poorly about it, that might be an emotional reaction that overrides any kind of logic they have. Or it might not mean that way. That's for you to figure out as a GM in the moment. I don't think you need another system to do that. I don't think you need to ditch rolling for these to do that. It's all about how you interpret it. And you are supposed to interpret these before you throw them out there. So I think they need to rethink it. But I understand where this kind of stuff comes from, because I think people just kind of take the stuff in the books. Oh, it says 2, panic, 2, run away. So when you hit 2, run away. It can mean that, but I never think that. I don't think any of these tables present them as being super dogmatic. If you get a 2, that the monster must run away, and you cannot interpret that another way. I think the concept I get, or the rules as intended, the text as intended, is that here is the archetypal action that matches that morale or that reaction, but there are other possible ones, but it should mean something in that vein. If you really feel like that there's no way they're going to do half the things on the table, then yeah, you shouldn't roll. If you know the guards are stalwart, they're never going to give up, and they're never going to be super friendly, then yeah, you don't need to roll for morale because they're not going to be really testing it. There's no reason to test it if possibilities aren't really possible given their situations. But I will read those other articles at some point. Maybe I'll cover them in another video if I read them and they're intriguing. But I think that they have some misconceptions about how to use morale and reactions. But of course, I always love reading this stuff. Did I give him an upvote? I didn't. Oh, Dwiz Khalifa, whose darkness rules we looked at in one of the earlier streams, responded. Dwiz Khalifa says, I used to do only what you're considering. Just role play out every decision and use my own judgment to answer these questions rather than relying on dice and rules. But then I started using reaction and morale rolls, and here's what I found. Role play when the answer is clear to me and I can make a firm judgment, but default to the reaction or morale rules otherwise. I'm continually surprised at just how often my PCs meet an NPC who I really have no idea what the appropriate reaction would be. Obviously, I can just make a decision about their personality in the moment, but in hindsight, I was always kind of bad at that and always defaulted to one or two responses every time. I like outsourcing these kinds of things to impartial dice. Likewise, I was always the kind of referee who would have my monsters occasionally flee or parlay in combat, but I'll admit I always had trouble overthinking when they would do it. When I prepare an adventure scenario, there'll be predetermined reactions and retreats and whatnot. The cult members will attack any PC on site. The goblins will scatter if their pyromancer is killed. The smuggler will help out anyone affiliated with the Thieves Guild. But I just can't anticipate every time I'll need to make one of those judgments, so having a rule I can fall back on is really convenient for me. And then Jared B. Great said, I tried to remember morale. It can make a huge difference, especially with cowardly monsters. As for the reaction roll, some monsters are planned to have certain reactions or react certain ways based on the situation. Also, monsters who already have any kind of relationship to the PCs are just role-played accordingly. If they have allied with the kobolds against the goblins, kobolds are not just going to just attack powerful-seeming allies who are killing off their enemies, unless something happens to cause it. I do use reaction rolls, though, for most creatures. I like the randomness, the not having everything planned, and the results are usually more like guidelines. Besides, it's better than falling into the trap of thinking of everything as a combat. Immediately attack is rare enough that I'd usually just roll with it, though, and have the monsters attack them unless there's a good reason they wouldn't. All right. All right. I'll just give some more upvotes. Most of them are saying essentially what I was saying, right? You got to use the context. Sure, if you already know ahead of time absolutely what the morale or the reaction should be, then you can just use that. But oftentimes we don't know. Oftentimes there's a lot of gray area. And I think you are supposed to interpret the results as opposed to just going by a strict, because it says flee on the table, that they flee. I mean, that might be it. And oftentimes I will use that because, like I said, I look at that as it's in a panic. But again, that's contextual. If this is in combat and they morale, it's a panic. If it's in a social situation and they hit that, then maybe that might mean that they roll over and give the PCs anything they're asking for. They've been dominated or charmed or convinced. It can have a whole host of meanings depending on the situation. You as the GM need to have that context built up and then use the context to interpret the results that you're getting in the tables. And then once you have that interpretation, you communicate it to the players in the fiction. And that's going to look at different things depending on a whole bunch of circumstances and variables that only you are going to know in the moment. But it was a good idea, a good thought experiment, if you will. All right, folks. I don't think I have anything else. I think that'll be the last one for this session. Before you bail out of here, give the video a thumbs up if you don't mind. If you happen to find yourself in the stream or you're listening to this later and you're not subscribed, or watching this later and not subscribed, go ahead and subscribe. Helps me out. Get to be informed when I post new videos. Yada yada yada. If you're listening to this podcast form. I am really looking for some reviews. I don't have any. I know people listen to the audio versions because I've had over 2,000 downloads of the podcast, and yet no reviews. So give me a review, even if it's terrible, I guess, though I hope not. I'll take it just to have something. In any case, have a great rest of your day, night, weekend, whenever you're watching or listening to this. I will be back sooner rather than later. Enjoy the rest of whatever you are, and game on. Talk to you later, everybody. Oh, and happy Friday.